Silent Hill is a game of details. Hello everyone! For the next few months I will be analyzing selected retro games and seeing what, if any of their design, we can apply to our own modern sensibilities. In this video I will be exploring Silent Hill 1 in depth. It is advised that you've played it and have some rudimentary knowledge of its inner workings. Keep in mind that I will not be factoring any external Silent Hill media in regards to this analysis, and the only times I reference the developers will be in comments made or interviews conducted exclusively with Team Silent members during and before 1999. I also want to make an effort to see this game through the lens of what it set out to do, and not any personal biases I might bring to the table. With the ground rules set, let's get started. Oh, and it goes without saying, but this video contains mature content. To really grasp the magnitude of Silent Hill's release, we need to remember the landscape of 1999. Some months prior to the release of Silent Hill, we had gotten Half-Life, Grim Fandango, Metal Gear Solid, Banjo-Kazooie, Thief, Fallout 2, Apes Exodus, and arguably the most influential of them all, Ocarina of Time. It's not exactly like we were lacking in genre-defining experiences at the time, so to point at an obscure Japanese horror title from a team consisting of staff members who had failed at their previous projects and had planned to leave the publishing company and say, this is one of the best games of one of the best eras in gaming is a big deal. The aforementioned games all did something to the respective genre, whether it was redefine it, create it, or conclude it. And I suppose Silent Hill shares elements of the first two. Resident Evil had already solidified the rules for survival horror, but Silent Hill did to them what its blood brother did to conventional stealth at the time, which was to turn them on their heads to create something new. But where Metal Gear Solid created the postmodern action game, Silent Hill gave us psychological horror. But not really. At least not in the conventional meaning of the term. Psychological horror refers to the character's mental states, which is surely true of Silent Hill, seeing as the characters are made to enter a nightmare, manifested from a psychic girl's fears, being conjured up from a demon embryo residing within her, but more on that later. But Silent Hill uses the psychological horror for window dressing. The actual horror in Silent Hill is a lot simpler and a lot more complex than psychology. Horror games up to that point, and still today, somehow, thought and think that horror is about frightening the viewer. But not Silent Hill. To understand Silent Hill is to understand its greatest influence, David Lynch. David Lynch, just like Team Silent, knew that psychological horror is in the mind of the audience, not on the screen. What's on screen is only there as an armature onto which the player's mind sculpts the experience. Team Silent doesn't want you to jump out of your seat. They want you to think. So it's good they take after David Lynch, especially since both are fascinated with nightmares and perception. Video games are interactive. Therefore, they are inherently more immersive than any other medium. The player can walk away, but the game doesn't keep playing. Participation is the experience, and because of that, there is a ground rule for psychological horror. Never make your player into an audience. Silent Hill never breaks this rule. Whenever they show the player something, they only show them half the image. The blurry textures and jagged polygons might make for a lack of detail, but everyone knows what the red smear across the wall is. Because you know what you're seeing but don't see it clearly, the developers manage to have you fill in the blank. Participation yields immersion. And to illustrate that point, let's view and contrast these two scenes. The first from Resident Evil and the second from Silent Hill. Bear in mind that I'm not claiming one to be better than the other, simply contrasting.
What is this? What's going on here?
Did you notice the difference? If Resident Evil was a psychological horror game, then they wouldn't have used a cutscene. might have rather just had a pool of blood running down the hallway to suggest the things to come, and the zombie be obfuscated by the wall with maybe just a shadow cast on the wall behind Jill to hint at its form. The player might then retreat down the hallway for a sense of safety, but the trick of psychology would already have been achieved by then. Silent Hill has a corpse strung up on a fence after an unexpected jump tonight, and then has Harry be murdered before waking up again. That scene kicks the player's notion of reality right under them, and puts the player in the uneasy position of form-filling the strung-up corpse in their heads. I made this contrast for a second reason. Silent Hill was labeled a shameless Resident Evil clone during its release, which is an unfair statement, but one that shows the nuance of Silent Hill's inner workings, since that statement could have been made at all. There are two things that make this an unfair thing to say, though. Number one, you can't exactly patent or claim any mechanical balancing as your own, and the survival horror system in Resident Evil was already established before Resident Evil refined it. And number two is that outside of the playstyle and their respective series' recent dip in quality and promise of a comeback with a playable teaser, the games aren't really comparable. Maybe in quality, but only so far as they are both great games. Compared to one another, it's apples and oranges. Resident Evil is all about the visceral scares and has a more action-oriented approach, but Silent Hill is pure atmosphere. If Resident Evil managed to gamify the B-movie horror, then Silent Hill managed to gamify the more subtle Lynchian horror, where reality is blurred from the player, like how in the opening he is killed and then wakes up in a diner and meets Sybil, who was heading into Silent Hill at the same time as Harry before Alessa's astral projection caused both of them to crash. Harry and Sybil have a brief discussion before Harry asks her about Cheryl, who he had chased to the aforementioned alleyway after the crash but before the diner scene. Sybil answers that the only person she's seen is him, and he ponders where everybody is. Harry decides to go out and find Cheryl, and after a short discussion, she decides to lend him a gun for protection. Before the player leaves the diner, they pick up a radio that emits static and fight a pterodactyl-like creature. They can also save their progress near the arcade machine.
But I'm alright, I guess.
Glad to hear it.
The cutscene that plays has an otherworldly ambience music to it to give it a sense of unreality.
Wait a second, I'm just a tourist.
The dialogue is wooden, weird, and forced but lazy, but seeing as this is a horror game and that adds to the strangeness, it's actually sorta good.
I don't know what happened.
I don't want to ruin the effect, but notice in your next playthrough how every character is first introduced with a high polygon cutscene before being portrayed as a low polygon stick figure. They did that so the player has a reference point to draw from when they need to fill in the blanks on the low poly models. You might also have noticed how when the game needs to use the low polygon models in a cutscene, it tends to distance the camera a bit, or frame the scene in a way that the facial movement isn't visible. That was done to save time on animating detailed movement. For those that don't know, the entirety of Silent Hill cinematics were done by one man, working all day, every day, for 2.5 years. He did it alone because the higher-ups at Konami wanted to assign him a supervisor and give him top billing on the animations, but Sato didn't want to share credit on solo work simply because of his age, so he refused, opting instead to animate the whole thing himself. I want to believe that some of the stories of the game's development have been exaggerated, but the story of Sato living in the office and using the team's computers to render when they left for the day is one that, though unbelievable, can likely be taken at face value. One of Sato's, and in fact the entire team's, biggest hurdles when it came to creating the game was the fact that it was supposed to have an American style to it. Team Silent was originally not well versed in horror or American culture, and a lot of the game was cobbled together from movies, books, and television. There wasn't any Caucasian staff members that Sato could use to create the faces, so he likely had to go off some photos and videos when designing. I don't have any source to back this up, but I'm sure he had a photo of Cameron Diaz somewhere and just went to town. The team's largest influence by far was David Lynch, but second place might go to Stephen King. Stephen King's influence can be seen in the abusive relationship between Alessa and Dahlia, which is likely a parallel to that of Margaret and Carrie White from his novel Carrie, with both mothers being abusive religious fanatics and both daughters being psychic and wanting a better life. The fog and the pterodactyls come from the novel The Mist, and the psychic powers and uneasy cinematography from The Shining and its 1980 film adaptation. There are more subtle ones, like the arcade machine which references Children of the Corn or Bachman Street, but those don't really impact the story. On the subject of which, and going back to Alessa and Dahlia, there's been a lot of confusion about Alessa, the cult, their rituals, and their presence in the town, which I want to quickly go over and maybe help straighten a few things out. The reason for the events in Silent Hill transpiring as they did was because Alessa's pain called out to Cheryl Mason to return to her, as she is the split half of her soul. Alessa split her soul in two, 7 years before the events of the game, to prevent the cult from birthing a demon god, and Dahlia decided to keep her in pain for those years in an attempt to lure Cheryl back to her so the ritual could be completed. But Alessa lured Cheryl to her, not to wreak havoc, but in order to spread the seal of Metatron, which when completed would purge Silent Hill from the world and end the threat of the cult's god. Alessa is bedridden from a boiler explosion, which is why she couldn't spread the seal herself. The demon in her was to be birthed by the cult, which is led by her mother, Dahlia Gillespie. The cult's influence comes from the wealth acquired from spreading a drug called PTV. Dahlia and the cult believe that there is no good or evil, but rather order and chaos, and that to create paradise, they must first purify the world. This leads them to attempt to birth their god within Alessa Gillespie. However, during the ritual there was a boiler explosion, which may or may not have been caused by Alessa's psychic power, either willingly or accidentally. There is some contention in the Silent Hill community over whether or not the boiler explosion happened or was a cover story for the fire which was caused by their attempting to burn Alessa. I don't think this is super important in order to understand Silent Hill, but in the interest of taking a stance on the matter, there was most likely an unexpected boiler explosion behind the fire. I highly doubt the cult planned to burn Alessa, seeing as that kinda set a 7-year halt to their entire plan. Not to mention the fact that the ritual was supposed to impregnate her, which would have been difficult if she'd been burnt to ashes. There's a lot of Silent Hill material that contradicts this, but in the interest of analyzing this game as a standalone title, unbiased by later installments, the answer the team wanted the player to arrive at was that Alessa caused the boiler explosion to stop the cult from ever birthing their god. We can't be sure of that being her intention, seeing as, though she was likely a suicidal or at least depressed child, she had a very strong moral compass and a lot of empathy. Throughout the game, Alessa uses Cheryl to spread the seal of Metatron, which causes the spread of the nightmare. Alessa is likely not aware of this, or at least content in her goal to stop the demon from entering the world. Alessa, having reunited with Cheryl and thus gaining her memories and love for Harry, is likely the reason for his affinity in battling the nightmare, and might explain why he survived being killed in the beginning, if Alessa cares too much about him to let him be hurt. Alessa is often misunderstood and villainized, but she's probably the closest the game has to a definitive hero. The first time the player is introduced to the Seal of Metatron is in the Midwich Elementary School, which is the second time they encounter the Otherworld. The Otherworld uses the environmental immersion against the player in a most devious way. Before it appears, the player will have had to traverse the entirety of the area that the nightmare will be projected on, solving puzzles and backtracking through it a few times. After the player has gotten the hang of moving through the environment and opened up all the shortcuts, the game takes a complete 180, ditches quiet time and enters pure hell. Since the game conditions the player to think of the locations in a realistic way, the jump to the Otherworld is made that much more jarring. The two main goals when Team Silent designed the game was to push technology and realism. The first of these goals famously resulted in the fog, but also the dark segments. The dark segments force the player to use the flashlight, which gives a limited field of view, but more importantly, creates negative space through lighting, which focuses the player's eyes towards Harry, helping them to bond with him. Back in the diner we picked up a radio, and I want to briefly discuss its inclusion. Silent Hill, the final product, is a result of rigorous removal and compromising to make the game work. The game is balanced around unease, which means combat needs to be somewhat clunky. But since the player rarely has a good view of events, the unease of combat would turn into jump scare combat, and since jump scares reset the tension cycle, that would break the spell. So to get around tension fatigue, the team added the radio to warn the player of surrounding enemies without giving them more visual clarity, and since it's only the sound of static, the monsters themselves still get to spook with their visuals when they arrive in frame, and build up tension with their unseen presence. I don't have any interviews or design documents verifying that as the reason for the inclusion of the radio, and want to tell you that it's pure speculation on my part, but I'm confident in this theory. As stated earlier, the team had to cut a lot of content out to make the game work, and if so, the inclusion of the radio doesn't make much sense otherwise. seeing as they might have instead ditched it to make the town larger, which they were keen to do. If the radio is not there to fix something, then it is additional content and doesn't add as much as other content would have. But if the radio is there to balance a system, then its inclusion makes complete sense and makes it more important than a larger map, since the game wouldn't work without it. The map itself helps to push the secondary design goal of realism. The triangle button is mapped to open up the map, and opening it up is almost a necessity to navigate the world. Since the player is relying on a physical map for progression, they need to, and I mentioned this earlier, think of the environments in a logical way, which both adds to the world building and the player immersion. After killing the Splithead and exiting the school, the player meets up with Dahlia, who won't be revealed to be a villain until much later, but, I mean, come on, look at her. After the cutscenes, she's nowhere to be found, and this is always the case when the player meets a character. They can never move around in any room with another present character, and I have a few thoughts on why that is. The first is that without some AI, the characters might behave in an unrealistic way and break immersion. The second is that prohibiting them from doing so adds to the sense of loneliness. The third is that having them wait around for Harry to move undermines their place in the story and makes everything reliant on him. After closing the drawbridge, the player makes their way to Alchemilla Hospital, where they are introduced to Kaufman and Lisa Garland. The most common enemy in the hospital is the puppet nurses, who are being controlled by parasites in their backs. The parasites might be symbolic for the demon in Alessa, who feeds off her negative energy, but the enemy itself is symbolic for Alessa's dislike of hospitals, and the parasites might also represent how the staff is being controlled by the cult. Which is a strenuous link, seeing as Alessa was kept hidden for most of the hospital staff, which suggests that the cult didn't have as much power in the hospital as my theory requires. But remember that Alessa is projecting the nightmare, and Alessa likely wasn't aware of the full extent of the cult's influence. Kaufman's dialogue tells us that the monsters aren't real, but Lisa's dialogue tells us that there were more people around not too long ago, and that they are alone, but also that she is aware of the puppet nurses. I want to point out that Lisa is Alessa's caretaker, but is also a drug addict, suffering from withdrawal, so she isn't as reliable a source of information as we would hope, and that Kaufman is affiliated with the cult, and thus might not be either. Dahlia is obviously the head of the cult, and Sybil is native to the town. None of the characters we interact with seem to be reliable. In the hospital, the player can pick up some Aglaophatis from the floor, which unlocks the plus endings. The hospital is also the second time we meet Dahlia, and this time, she starts to explain what's going on, but she's lying to get Harry to stop the spread of the seal of Metatron. After the discussion, the next stop is the antique store, where Harry reunites with Sybil before waking up in the hospital again. This time we are not actually in the hospital, but rather in Alessa's dream, and we learn a little bit about the backstory of the town from Lisa, but remember that she isn't reliable. After the discussion, Harry wakes up again in the antique store and heads to the town center. This is the start of the second half of the game, and if the first half is Twin Peaksian horror, then the second half is its crueler older brother. The later half might be the reason people think Alessa is evil, seeing as there's a lot of monsters trying to kill Harry, but remember that Alessa is not in control of the nightmare. If anything is, it's probably the demonic Embryo, though even that might be an oversimplification. Throughout the game, we get hints to a spiritual power that has existed in Silent Hill long before the demon was brought to the world, and that spiritual power is fleshed out further in the sequels. The second half of the game is a payoff to the quiet time in the first half, and even though it has a lot of it itself, it is no doubt the louder half of the game. Before continuing, I want to make sure we're on the same level. Quiet time is to pacing what negative space is to composition. Both serve to balance and give power to the louder, more dense aspects of the piece in question. One of the reasons for why the Otherworld hits as hard as it does, even though it isn't very challenging, is because the crutch is kicked from under you with lighting, and because the sound and enemies become more apparent. It's such a stark contrast to the other half of the game that it is inherently unnerving. It's telling of the importance of both the skillful use of quiet time and negative space in Silent Hill, that lesser games often have louder and more dangerous moments than the Otherworld, but don't unnerve me as much as the thought of going to the Otherworld does. Goes to show that presentation is often more important than what's being presented. In the town center, Harry fights the Twin Feeler before reuniting with Lisa at the hospital yet again. She informs him about the sewers, and on his way there, Harry fights a float stinger. The later half of the game has a lot of insects, with many of the standard enemies in the first half being replaced with similar ones whose heads have been replaced with worms. We find out later that Alessa has a butterfly collection in her room, which goes some ways in explaining the abundance of these enemies. After killing the float stinger, the nightmare ends and Harry goes to the sewers. Something I've neglected to mention is the game's use of space. The game manages to convey tightness in large spaces and openness in confined spaces. This is because of the fog, the darkness, and the amount of movement required. In large spaces, the path the player has to take is very strict, but in tighter spaces the player might need to backtrack and explore for items, which lends some sense of discovery to them. When exiting the sewer, reality shifts into a nightmare and Harry reunites with Sybil on a boat. She says she went through the sewers and gets confirmation that it was Harry who cut the fence. She infers to where he disappeared to in the antique store and wants to know what's going on with the town.
I want to know what's going on here.
Harry explains the going-ons as best as he understands them, and some lines of dialogue later, Dahlia shows up, blurs the truth and tells Harry to stop the spreading of the seal at the lighthouse and amusement park. Harry goes to the lighthouse and Sybil to the amusement park. When Harry arrives at the lighthouse, the seal has already been made, so he returns to the boat to find Sybil not having returned. He decides to go to the amusement park himself and does so through the sewers. Sybil also went through the sewers, and the next time we meet her is at the merry-go-round, where we learn that she was possessed by a parasite in the sewers. I don't know if it was the same parasite as the nurses are infected with, and here's why. A Glophatis is a red liquid that exercises evil. If the player acquired a Glophatis in the hospital and exposes Sybil to it, then the parasite will leave her body. But if the player tries to use the technique on the nurses instead, nothing happens. This means that either the nurses aren't real and thus no evil to exercise, or no host to be exercised, or that Team Silent didn't intend for the player to use the Glophatis on anything else than Sybil. The first one is likelier and would mean that the fog world is part of the nightmare, and that it could be the same parasite. I say that because this game has so much detail poured into it that this would be a very weird limitation to place on the player, and a very jarring design decision from a game so internally realized that it has Harry writing logs of his exploits should someone come to find him be the narrative justification of saving their progress. Whether or not the player uses the Glophatis in the battle determines whether or not they get the normal ending or the plus ending. After battling Sybil, Harry runs into Alessa and demands to have Cheryl back. He then uses the flowers to break through a barrier, and shortly after, Dahlia shows up, makes some revelations, and teleports Alessa and herself away from there. Harry then wakes up in the hospital with Lisa, who makes some revelations of her own before running to the basement. Harry leaves to follow her. This time we are not actually in El Camilla, but in Nowhere, which is an area comprised of Alessa's memories, and if you need any further proof of her allegiance, then this is it. She teleported Harry to Nowhere, without needing to do so, just so that he could stop the birth of the god. Before fighting the final boss, I want to talk about the nature of the Embryo. Silent Hill has a flattering relationship with the concept of metamorphosis. That, and the numerous appearances of insects, leads me to the subject of parasites. In nature, there's a specific type of parasite known as a parasitoid. These pests hatch their eggs in another living creature, and their young then use that creature for nourishment. Alessa collects butterflies and likely has an interest in metamorphosis. She has also been unwillingly impregnated with a being that feeds off her negative energy and once born will cause nothing but harm to others. The game frames metamorphosis, love, and faith, all very natural events in a perverted light. Metamorphosis isn't necessarily a good thing, as seen in Sybil, who is controlled by a parasite and changed into an enemy against her will. Love is perverted when Dahlia's fanaticism brought her to use her daughter as an offering to the love of God, and faith is dangerous as it can interact with the spiritual power of the town. Silent Hill is subversive. Remember this, the zombies in Resident Evil, for all intents and purposes, are zombies, and their sharks are sharks. The split head and the air screamer in Silent Hill are not a lizard and a pterodactyl, but rather a physical manifestation of a tortured girl's love of literature. And the float stinger is similar, but instead represents her interest and likely fear of metamorphosis. Nature isn't pure in Silent Hill because parasites crawl their way in and ruin it. Whether it's family, allies, faith, or memories, doesn't matter. In Nowhere, Lisa becomes a puppet nurse, and we find out her backstory. We also find out about the aftermath of the birthing ritual, and get to know what caused Cheryl to turn to the town. We then get a quick glimpse of Dahlia and Alessa before the ritual, and then enter the final boss. In the final area, we have a quick discussion with Dahlia before fighting either the Incubus or the Incubator, depending on whether or not the player rescued Kaufman in Annie's bar earlier and finished his side quest. The fights lead to either the good or bad ending, with Sybil's engagement deciding whether the plus or normal variant of that ending is reached. Depending on the player's actions throughout the game, multiple endings will open up, but I will only be discussing the 4 main ones. Should the player save Sybil but not Kaufman, then the bad plus ending will trigger, where Harry must fight the Incubator. Cheryl will then thank her father before bidding a final goodbye. Harry then falls to his knees in distress but is put back on his feet by Sybil, who had earlier fired at Dahlia. If the player saved neither Sybil nor Kaufman, then they will fight the Incubator, receive Cheryl's farewell and fall to their knees. But this time, they will be shown a dead Harry in his truck, meaning that the whole thing might have been his dying hallucination. The good ending is achieved if the player rescued Kaufman but not Sybil. During the final confrontation with Dahlia, he exposes Alessa to a Glophatus and forces out the Incubus. After defeating it, Harry receives a newborn baby from Alessa and heads out to safety. Kaufman attempts to leave but is held back by Lisa Garland. Harry is then shown to have exited the nightmare with the newborn baby. The good plus ending is achieved if the player rescued both Kaufman and Sybil. In the good plus ending, Sybil fires at Dahlia and is knocked out again, but during Harry's final meeting with Dahlia, Kaufman walks in, shoots Dahlia and exposes Alessa to a Glophatus, which again forces out the Incubus. After killing the Incubus, Alessa hands over to Harry a newborn baby and points him to the exit. He's joined by Sybil and they run out to safety. Kaufman tries to leave but is dragged down by Lisa. Alessa keeps an eye on them as they leave before collapsing, and the opening intro is repeated, but with Sybil standing in for Harry's wife. And that wraps up Silent Hill's story. The vagueness of its presentation creates and drives both speculation and exploration respectively, both of whom are immersion building and push the goal of realism. It has often been suggested that conventional pacing doesn't work in a video game because the player is too involved, or because games aren't abstract enough to break the realism barrier and let the viewer overlook the flaws. Silent Hill's narrative is player-driven. How much they uncover about the going-ons is directly linked to how much they explore the world. Not to forget that the speculation narrative also helps solidify its David Lynch influence. I mentioned how the team was supposed to give the game an American style, but in doing so, they made it uncanny since they lack the cultural lens to properly convey it. That uncanniness is why everything looks and feels right, but just isn't somehow. Quickly back on the subject of subversion, the characters are all flat, but subtly, subvertly so. You can tell a flat character by the complications behind their actions and the change they undergo in the story. If both are none, then the character is called flat. Silent Hill's characters undergo some events, but they don't really change that much. It's just that things happen to them and they respond. Sybil is a skeptic through and through, and her most major event occurs in the sewers, where she is made a puppet for the Parasite and made to fight Harry in the merry-go-round. This event doesn't fundamentally change her as a character or deepen her relationship with Harry, or her sense of self. Kaufman is uneasy in the hospital when we first meet him. His state of mind is likely caused by Dahlia smashing his vials of a Glophatus, which he had kept in order to have a weapon against the cult should they ever deviate into an area he wouldn't like. In the end, his most important moment is in exercising the Incubus, but note that there wasn't any major change or complicated motivational shift that drove him to do so. The only way he wouldn't have done it was if he had died, so his interaction with Harry wasn't necessarily what drove him to oppose Dahlia. His death at Lisa's hands undermined his plot significance, but it's interesting to note that the most major change in the story is dependent on the fate of one of its most minor characters, and no matter what the player does, his fate is the same. He dies. Harry undergoes the greatest horror imaginable, and I'm not talking about the nightmare. A father loses his daughter. The two themes of Silent Hill were realism and to push limitations. The horror of losing a child is real. Harry is pushed to the limits to reclaim her. Silent Hill really pushed the preconceived limitations of the medium. And even today, 17 years later, it keeps on pushing them. Because it's timeless. Silent Hill is a game of details, of meaningful mechanics and real emotions. The raw pain of the otherworld is both absolutely insane, but also logical. The design is bonkers, but the materials are real. Fences, rust, and wires. If Silent Hill could be summarized in one word, that word would be atmosphere. I don't like to revisit this game because it's so dark. The story of the psychological torment of a 7-year-old girl by her mother and the horror of parenthood gone wrong isn't one I like to revisit. But it hits hard. It hits hard because it's real. Because the problems are real. The context is bonkers Lynchian stuff, but the story of a man searching for his missing daughter is scarier than any ghost or zombie could ever be. The exploration of Dahlia and Alessa's relationship is another real horror story, and this game doesn't get enough praise for its maturity and realism. It hurts to experience Silent Hill, so I try to limit my visits. But don't take that as a criticism. This is one of my favorite games. It's one of the best games of all times, and if we want to learn something from it, how about this? Everything can work in your favor if you approach it with a winning attitude. The system limitation created the fog and darkness, which create the mood. The limitations also made AI more simplistic, which meant there wasn't going to be any friendlies on screen, and that it would need to play clunky to work. The first creates a sense of loneliness, and the second gives Harry more characterization than any cutscene possibly could. The cultural difference brought an uncanny touch to the game, and on it goes. This game has no right to be as good as it is. Team Silent had a winning attitude. So whenever limitations came up, the team managed to use it to their favor. Never give up if it matters. If what you're striving for really means something to you, then you need to find a way to turn your limits to strengths and break through. Thanks for watching. In the next retro analysis, we'll be diving headfirst into the arcades. Be sure to leave some feedback on game suggestion, analysis response, or just to say hello. Hope to see you again.